When the world's most advanced military machines roar across enemy skies, they carry with them not just bombs and missiles, but also an invisible passenger, the risk of catastrophic failure that no amount of technological brilliance can ever completely erase. History has taught us again and again in Blood and Burning Metal that even the mightiest air force in the world can be brought down by a single, well-placed missile fired from the very ground it seeks to dominate. This fundamental truth that air superiority is never absolute and always comes at a cost forms the bedrock of understanding why the United States and its allies found themselves in such a difficult and dangerous position as they launched air campaigns against Iran. No matter how advanced the aircraft being deployed, no matter how sophisticated the avionics or how stealthy the fuselage, the moment a plane flies over hostile territory where surface-to-air missile systems and anti-aircraft artillery are positioned and waiting, that aircraft faces a genuine and very real chance of being destroyed. This is not a hypothetical scenario or a theoretical concern drawn from military textbooks. It is a lesson written in the wreckage of dozens of aircraft shot down over Vietnam, where American pilots flying machines that were technically superior to almost everything the enemy possessed found themselves falling from the skies with painful and tragic regularity. The Vietnam War remains one of the most instructive military conflicts in modern history when it comes to understanding the limitations of air power in contested environments. Time after time, American aircraft were shot down not because they were poorly designed or because their pilots were undertrained, but simply because the enemy on the ground had missiles and artillery that could reach them. The lesson was painful and expensive, and it forced a complete rethinking of how air campaigns should be conducted and what could realistically be expected from them. In the context of the campaign against Iran, both the United States and Israel had invested enormous effort and significant military resources in attempting to neutralize Iran's ground-based air defense network before committing their aircraft to sustained operations over Iranian territory. There is little doubt that these efforts achieved meaningful results. The combined aerial bombardment and electronic warfare operations managed to degrade Iran's integrated air defense system to a substantial degree, destroying radar installations, command centers, and missile batteries across multiple sites. However, and this is the critical point that analysts, planners, and politicians too often gloss over in their eagerness to project confidence and invincibility, complete elimination of a nation's air defenses is extraordinarily difficult to achieve in practice, no matter how comprehensive the initial strike package. Iran is a vast country with complex terrain, a resilient military culture, and decades of experience preparing for exactly this kind of scenario. Iranian military planners had long anticipated an American or Israeli air assault and had taken extensive precautions to ensure that at least some portion of their defensive capabilities would survive the opening strikes. This meant dispersal of equipment, redundancy in communications, hardened underground facilities, mobile missile launchers that could be repositioned quickly, and decentralized command structures that could continue to function even after central nodes were destroyed. The result was that somewhere amid the rubble and the dust, there were still functioning surface-to-air missile systems waiting, and eventually one of them found a target. When the news broke that an aircraft had been shot down over Iranian territory, it should not have surprised anyone with a serious understanding of modern aerial warfare. The incident was not a sign of exceptional Iranian military prowess, so much as a confirmation of basic physical and tactical realities that experts have understood for decades. What it did demonstrate, however, was the hollowness of the rhetoric coming from certain quarters, most notably from senior American officials who had been projecting an almost supernatural air of invincibility, suggesting that the campaign against Iran would proceed with frictionless efficiency and overwhelming success. That kind of overconfidence, history repeatedly shows us, is precisely the mindset that leads military planners into the most dangerous traps. Beyond the military calculus, beyond the strategic diagrams and the intelligence assessments, there lies the raw, devastating human reality of what war actually means for the people caught within it. In southern Iran, a school was struck by the scorching titanium fragments ejected from Tomahawk cruise missiles. Children, teachers, ordinary civilians going about the ordinary business of their lives were suddenly thrown into a world of fire and destruction they had done nothing to create and had no power to prevent. These are not abstractions. These are human beings, the same as anyone reading these words, and their suffering forms the moral foundation upon which any honest analysis of this conflict must ultimately rest. Against this backdrop of human suffering, it becomes necessary, even though it feels uncomfortable to do so, to ask the cold geopolitical question: who actually benefits from this war? It is a question that must be asked precisely because understanding the answer tells us something crucial about why the war happened, how it is likely to unfold, and what the world will look like when the fighting eventually stops. Geopolitical analysis does not require us to be callous or indifferent to human suffering. Rather, it requires us to look honestly at the forces and incentives that shape the decisions of powerful states, even when those decisions lead to enormous human tragedy. The answer, when examined with clear eyes and without ideological blinders, points strongly in the direction of two nations that are not directly involved in the fighting, but stand to gain enormously from its consequences. These two beneficiaries, Russia and China, occupy very different positions in the international system, have very different relationships with the United States, and have pursued very different strategies for improving their global standing. Yet in this particular conflict, their interests align remarkably closely, and the outcomes they stand to gain from are strikingly similar. The clearest winner. Of all the nations surveying the geopolitical landscape shaped by the Iran war, Russia emerges as perhaps the most unambiguous winner. The reasons for this are both direct and indirect, both economic and strategic, and they compound upon one another in ways that significantly improve Moscow's position in the international system at almost every level. Consider first the economic dimension. The outbreak of war in the Persian Gulf region and the disruption to Middle Eastern oil and gas supplies created an immediate and severe challenge for the global energy market. Oil prices spiked dramatically. Governments around the world scrambled to secure alternative supplies. And in Washington, the Trump administration found itself in an extremely difficult position. It needed to bring down domestic energy prices to prevent the war it had started from creating an unbearable economic burden for American consumers. The solution the administration chose was to relax the sanctions it had imposed on Russian oil and gas exports, a decision that delivered an enormous financial windfall directly to the Kremlin. The irony of this outcome cannot be overstated. The United States had spent years building and maintaining an elaborate sanctions architecture specifically designed to limit Russia's ability to earn revenue from its energy exports. The sanctions had not been entirely effective. Russia had found ways to continue selling oil and gas through alternative channels and to third-party buyers, but they had nonetheless imposed real costs and created real constraints. Now, in a single stroke driven by the energy chaos created by the Iran war, all of that was reversed. Russia was effectively handed a massive and largely unconditional economic bonus, not because of anything clever it did, but simply because America's own foreign policy misadventure created the conditions that made it necessary. The strategic benefits for Russia extend well beyond this direct economic gain, however. The Iran war has also had profound consequences for America's ability to sustain its support for Ukraine. The United States military maintains large but not unlimited stockpiles of certain critical weapon systems and munitions. Every Tomahawk cruise missile fired at targets in Iran is a Tomahawk that cannot be sent to Ukraine. Every precision-guided bomb dropped on Iranian facilities is a bomb that will not be available to help Ukrainian forces resist Russian advances. Every dollar spent on prosecuting the Iran campaign is a dollar that is not flowing into the weapons procurement programs, military aid packages, and logistical support systems that have sustained Ukraine's resistance to Russian aggression. As spring and summer approach, bringing with them the improved ground conditions that typically favor the kind of large-scale offensive operations at which Russian forces excel, the timing could hardly be worse for Ukraine. Russian military planners have been preparing for a major push, and the diversion of American attention, resources, and military hardware to the Persian Gulf has left Ukraine in a substantially more vulnerable position than it would otherwise be. From Moscow's perspective, this represents a tremendous strategic gift, one that appeared on their doorstep not through their own exertions, but as an accidental byproduct of Washington's decision to go to war with Iran. It is difficult to resist the observation that Russia has a powerful and continuing interest in ensuring that the war with Iran drags on for as long as possible. Every week that the United States remains bogged down in this conflict is another week of reduced support for Ukraine, another week of elevated energy prices that benefit Russian exports, and another week of damage to American credibility and influence around the world. Whether or not Russia is actively working to prolong the conflict through covert means, supplying intelligence, equipment, or diplomatic support to Iran, the structural incentives pointing in that direction are overwhelming. China's gains from the Iran war are somewhat less immediate and more diffuse than Russia's, but in many respects they may prove to be more enduring and ultimately more significant for the long-term balance of global power. Where Russia benefits primarily through direct economic and military strategic gains, China benefits above all through a process of accelerated erosion of American credibility, reliability, and moral authority on the world stage. The Middle East has historically been a region where American power and influence has been substantial, if not always wisely exercised. The United States has maintained close relationships with the Gulf states, provided security guarantees that have underpinned regional stability, and positioned itself as the indispensable outside power to which regional actors turned when they needed support, mediation, or protection. This positioning gave Washington enormous leverage and a degree of influence over Middle Eastern affairs that no other outside power could match. The Iran war has done serious damage to this positioning. The very act of launching a major military campaign in the region, one that has disrupted oil markets, threatened the stability of neighboring states, and demonstrated a willingness to act unilaterally and without coherent strategic planning, has caused many Middle Eastern nations to question whether the United States is truly a reliable partner or simply an unpredictable and potentially dangerous actor whose proximity creates as many problems as it solves. China, by contrast, has been positioning itself as a more stable, more predictable, and more commercially reliable partner for Middle Eastern states. One that wants to do business, buy oil and gas, invest in infrastructure, and maintain peaceful relations rather than reshape the region through military intervention. The damage to American credibility extends well beyond the Middle East, however. Across the developing world in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, in the Pacific Islands nations that have been carefully weighing the relative merits of closer alignment with Washington versus closer alignment with Beijing, are watching the Iran war and drawing their own conclusions. What they see is a United States that operates, in the words of one analyst, like a foreign policy apparatus that cannot function rationally within the constraints of international law, that lurches from one crisis to another without coherent strategy, and that makes decisions that impose enormous costs on third parties without adequate consultation or warning. In this environment, the calculation that many nations make when choosing between American and Chinese alignment shifts notably in China's favor. This is not because China is necessarily a more virtuous international actor. It has its own record of aggressive behavior, questionable human rights practices, and willingness to use economic leverage coercively. Rather, it is because China at this moment appears to offer a more stable and predictable relationship, one less likely to suddenly drag you into a catastrophic military conflict you did not seek and do not want. The evidence for this shift is already visible in Europe, where nations that have historically been among America's closest allies are beginning to quietly reassess their relationship with Washington and explore whether greater independence or closer ties with other partners might better serve their national interests. India's position in relation to the Iran war is particularly complex and particularly painful. Unlike Russia and China, which stood to benefit from the conflict, India finds itself squeezed uncomfortably by it from multiple directions simultaneously. The reason for this uncomfortable position lies in the intricate web of important relationships that India has carefully cultivated with the principal parties, to the conflict relationships that now pull sharply in incompatible directions. India has historically maintained strong and mutually beneficial ties with Israel. Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Netanyahu had been photographed together warmly just in the days immediately before the American campaign against Iran was launched, a visible symbol of the closeness between the two governments and their shared strategic interests in counterterrorism, technology cooperation, defense procurement, and economic partnership. India has purchased sophisticated Israeli weapon systems, benefited from Israeli agricultural and water management expertise, and viewed Israel as an important partner in the broader project of India's modernization and defense capacity building. At the same time, India has developed important and deepening ties with Iran. The North-South Transport Corridor, an ambitious infrastructure project linking India through Iran to Russia and Central Asia, represents a major strategic investment in which Iran plays an indispensable geographical role. India's access to Central Asian markets and Russia depends heavily on Iranian territory and Iranian cooperation. Beyond this specific project, India and Iran have long-standing cultural, historical, and commercial ties that stretch back centuries, and that provide the foundation for a relationship of genuine mutual interest and respect. India also has close and increasingly important ties with the United States, which has been investing heavily in the relationship as part of its broader strategy of building partnerships in Asia to counterbalance Chinese influence. The Quad grouping, comprising the United States, India, Japan, and Australia, reflects a shared strategic interest in maintaining a stable and rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific. Modi had been among the first foreign leaders to visit Trump after the January 2025 inauguration, and the two men had cultivated a personal rapport that seemed to augur well for the bilateral relationship. Now, all of these carefully maintained relationships are under strain simultaneously. The war against Iran damages India's relationship with Tehran and jeopardizes the connectivity projects that depend on Iranian cooperation. India's closeness with Israel makes it difficult for New Delhi to loudly oppose the campaign, since doing so would damage that important bilateral relationship. And the United States, having launched the war without serious consultation with India, despite the enormous consequences it would have for Indian interests, has demonstrated once again that Washington is capable of making decisions of the gravest strategic importance to India without treating New Delhi as a genuine partner worthy of advance notice or serious consideration. The economic consequences for India are severe and multidimensional. India is a net importer of oil and heavily dependent on Persian Gulf supplies. When oil prices spike because of conflict in the region, India's import bill rises sharply, putting pressure on the current account, weakening the currency, and fueling domestic inflation. Fertilizer prices, critically important for Indian agriculture and therefore for food security, and the livelihoods of hundreds of millions of people are also significantly affected by disruptions to the energy market and to petrochemical supply chains. The cost of cooking gas for ordinary Indian households rises. The price of food in Indian markets climbs. Inflation, already a persistent challenge for the Indian government, worsens. The Indian media and public opinion have been largely united in their assessment of these consequences. Across the political spectrum, there is a widespread recognition that this war is genuinely harmful to Indian interests, that it is not, as some might try to spin it, a conflict in which India can somehow benefit or remain neutral. The damage is real, it is measurable, and it is being felt by ordinary Indians in their daily lives. That this situation was foreseeable, that the consequences of an American strike on Iran were predictable well in advance, makes it all the more frustrating for Indian policymakers who had hoped that their close relationship with both Washington and the Gulf states might provide some protection from exactly this kind of collateral damage. Understanding why the war in Iran turned into a prolonged and damaging conflict rather than the swift, decisive operation that American and Israeli planners had envisioned requires a clear-eyed examination of the fundamental strategic miscalculation that lay at the heart of the entire enterprise. This was not a failure of intelligence gathering, though intelligence failures played a role. It was not primarily a failure of military execution, though tactical mistakes were made. It was, at its core, a failure of strategic imagination, an inability or unwillingness to seriously consider how an adversary as capable, resilient, and deeply motivated as Iran would actually respond to military assault. The basic assumption driving American and Israeli planning appears to have been that Iran was fundamentally fragile, that its government was internally unpopular enough and economically stressed enough that a sufficiently dramatic and shocking military assault would cause the regime to either collapse or capitulate quickly. The model in the planners' minds seems to have been something like the shock and awe campaign that opened the 2003 invasion of Iraq, which did indeed succeed in rapidly disintegrating Iraqi military resistance and toppling Saddam Hussein's government. If the same formula could be applied to Iran, overwhelming air power, decapitation of leadership, disruption of command and control, then perhaps the Iranian regime would similarly crumble under the weight of sustained military pressure. This assessment was flawed in almost every important respect. Iran is not Iraq, and the Islamic Republic in 2025 is not Saddam's Ba'athist state in 2003. Iran has a large, disciplined, ideologically motivated military force with decades of operational experience. It has deeply rooted internal security services with proven capability to suppress dissent and maintain regime stability even under extreme external pressure. It has a population that, whatever the genuine divisions within Iranian society, tends to rally around the flag when the country is under foreign attack, as historical experience with Iraq in the 1980s conclusively demonstrated. And crucially, Iran has carefully developed and maintained a range of asymmetric military capabilities specifically designed to deny any attacker the quick, clean victory they might be hoping for. Perhaps most importantly, Iran sits astride the Strait of Hormuz, one of the single most strategically significant geographical choke points on the entire planet. Approximately one-fifth of the world's total oil supply and a significant fraction of its liquefied natural gas transits through this narrow waterway every single day. Iran has spent decades developing the military means to threaten, and if necessary close, this strait. It has missiles, naval mines, fast attack craft, submarines, and coastal defense systems specifically positioned and trained for this purpose. The mere credible threat of Hormuz closure can send global oil markets into a panic. Actually, closing or seriously disrupting the strait would cause an economic catastrophe of global proportions. Iran had notably chosen not to use this leverage during the Gaza conflict, despite enormous moral and political pressure from across the Arab world and from its own allies and proxies to do more in support of Palestinian civilians. This restraint was driven by Iran's own difficult economic circumstances. The country was already under severe sanctions pressure, and its leadership calculated that closing Hormuz would bring additional economic pain that the country could not easily absorb. But the restraint during Gaza should not have been read as evidence that Iran lacked the will or capability to use this card when its own existence and sovereignty were directly threatened. Once American and Israeli bombs began falling on Iranian soil, the entire calculus changed. Few topics in American foreign policy discourse have historically been more fraught, more politically sensitive, or more resistant to honest public examination than the role of the pro-Israel lobby in shaping American foreign policy decisions. For decades, serious scholarly analysis of how organized advocacy on behalf of Israeli interests has influenced American decisions about wars, sanctions, diplomatic recognition, military aid, and regional strategy was met with accusations of anti-Semitism, professional retaliation, and coordinated campaigns to marginalize and discredit the researchers involved. The barriers to honest discussion were high, and those who attempted to cross them did so at significant personal and professional risk. Two prominent political scientists who took exactly that risk, professors John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt published a landmark study in 2007 examining the Israel lobby's influence on American foreign policy, with particular focus on the lobby's role in bringing about the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Their argument that the organized pro Israel advocacy network in the United States had played a central, arguably decisive role in pushing the Bush administration toward the Iraq War, and that absent this pressure, the invasion would likely not have happened, was met with a firestorm of criticism, denunciation, and attempted character assassination. Yet the core analytical claims of their work, carefully documented and rigorously argued, were never successfully refuted on their merits. The Iran War has produced something that neither Mearsheimer nor Walt could easily have predicted when they published their work. The role of the Israel lobby in driving America to war has become a matter of open, explicit, mainstream public discussion in a way it never was during the Iraq episode. The most dramatic moment in this shift came when Joe Kent, who had served in a senior counterterrorism position in the Trump administration, before resigning, appeared publicly and stated with striking clarity and directness that Israel and the pro-Israel lobby in Washington bore primary responsibility for drawing the United States into the war against Iran. Kent was not a fringe figure, not an outsider critic, not an academic or journalist. He was a former insider who had seen the decision-making process from the inside. Kent went further, alleging that an investigation into a potential assassination plot against conservative commentator Charlie Kirk had been interfered with and undermined by individuals acting on behalf of Israeli interests within the administration. Whether or not this specific allegation is accurate, the willingness of a former senior government official to make it publicly and on the record represents a remarkable development in the public discourse around Israeli influence in American politics. It signals that the informal prohibition on discussing these matters openly, the unspoken rule that certain topics were simply off limits in polite political society, has broken down in a significant way. What is perhaps most significant about this development is the breadth of the political coalition that has coalesced around the view that Kent expressed. Tucker Carlson, a figure who commands enormous audiences on the American right, has been making similar arguments. Senator Bernie Sanders, who comes from the opposite end of the political spectrum, has been voicing related concerns. The convergence of voices from across the political divide on this particular question is genuinely unprecedented in recent American political history. It suggests that what was once a career-ending accusation, suggesting that Israel and its American advocates played a decisive role in pushing the United States toward a war, has become a claim that significant segments of both the American left and the American right are now willing to make openly and without apology. This does not mean that the debate is over or that a consensus has been reached. There remain many serious analysts and commentators who dispute both the factual claims being made and the broader analytical framework being applied. The role of any single actor or interest group in complex foreign policy decisions involving multiple competing bureaucracies, political pressures, and strategic calculations is always difficult to isolate and quantify with precision. But the fact that the conversation is happening at all, that it has moved from the margins of academic discourse to the center of mainstream political debate, represents a genuinely significant shift in the landscape of American foreign policy discussion. Understanding Israel's role in the Iran war requires grappling with the profound and deeply rooted sense of existential anxiety that shapes Israeli strategic thinking in ways that outside observers often find difficult to fully appreciate. Israel is a small country surrounded by adversaries, with a population that carries the living memory of the Holocaust and the knowledge that Jewish communities have historically been vulnerable to sudden, catastrophic violence. This historical experience, combined with decades of conflict with neighboring states and non-state actors, has produced a strategic culture that places enormous emphasis on preemption, on eliminating threats before they can fully materialize, and on maintaining overwhelming military superiority over any potential adversary. Iran, in Israeli strategic thinking, represents the most serious existential threat the country faces. The Iranian government's explicit hostility toward Israel, its support for Hezbollah in Lebanon, its support for Hamas in Gaza, its ballistic missile program, and above all, its nuclear enrichment activities, have been viewed in Jerusalem as an accumulating threat of potentially catastrophic proportions. For Israeli strategists, the question has long been not whether to act against Iran, but when and how, and the fear of acting too late has always weighed heavily on their calculations. The decision by Israel to strike the South Pars natural gas installation, a facility jointly owned by Qatar and Iran and representing one of the largest natural gas fields in the world, illustrates the extent to which Israeli strategic calculations can diverge sharply from American interests, even when the two countries are nominally fighting the same war. From an Israeli perspective, attacking Iran's energy infrastructure serves the goal of maximizing economic damage to the Iranian regime and degrading its ability to fund its military programs and proxy network. From an American perspective, this logic runs headlong into the risk of triggering exactly the kind of escalatory exchange of attacks on oil and gas infrastructure that could devastate the world economy and create an economic crisis of potentially catastrophic proportions. The Trump administration's reaction to the South Pars attack was reportedly swift and forceful. According to multiple accounts, the president made clear to Israeli leadership that the strike was unacceptable and must not be repeated, language notably stronger than the typically measured and carefully hedged communications that characterize American interactions with Israel on sensitive security matters. This represents a significant departure from the pattern of American behavior toward Israel that has prevailed for decades, in which Washington has generally found ways to accommodate or rationalize Israeli military actions, even when those actions created diplomatic or strategic complications for the United States. What this episode reveals is that there are limits previously unacknowledged, or at least undemonstrated, to American tolerance for Israeli unilateralism. Those limits, it seems, are located precisely at the point where Israeli military actions threaten to trigger an economic catastrophe that would have devastating consequences for the global economy, and by extension, for the American economy and the political fortunes of the sitting president. The world economy's dependence on Persian Gulf energy exports means that any sustained conflict involving the destruction of major oil and gas infrastructure in the region would send shockwaves through financial markets, supply chains, and consumer prices everywhere on Earth. The question of nuclear weapons, whether Israel might ultimately resort to them in a scenario where it believed its existence was genuinely threatened, adds an additional and terrifying dimension to this analysis. Israel is universally understood to possess nuclear weapons, though it has never officially acknowledged this. The Israeli doctrine of last resort, the willingness to use nuclear weapons if the state faced existential destruction, is real, even if rarely discussed openly in polite policy circles. As the war continues and the pressures on Israel mount, this dimension of the conflict cannot be entirely ignored, though it is not the most likely near-term scenario. The Gulf Arab states, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Oman, occupy a position of uncomfortable proximity to a conflict that threatens to consume the region's stability, and with it much of the economic prosperity that these states have worked to build over the past several decades. They are America's formal allies and security partners, hosting American military bases and dependent on the American security umbrella for protection against Iranian threats. Yet they are also geographically exposed to Iranian retaliation, economically linked to the stability of the energy market, and politically constrained by publics that harbor deep sympathy for the Palestinian cause and deep suspicion of American motives. The Gulf states claim, and there is reason to believe them on this point, that they did attempt to counsel restraint and to argue against military action before the United States launched its campaign. Saudi and Emirati officials reportedly made representations to Washington, emphasizing the risks of escalation, the unpredictability of the Iranian response, and the potential damage to regional stability. These representations were apparently not given sufficient weight in the American decision-making process, which had been captured by a different logic, one driven less by careful strategic calculation than by a combination of Israeli pressure, ideological commitment among certain American officials, and the belief that a demonstration of military force could achieve a quick and decisive outcome. The United Arab Emirates finds itself in a particularly complex situation, given that it is simultaneously a member of BRICS, the grouping of emerging economies that includes Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and several newer members, and a close security partner of the United States. Iran is also a BRICS member. The spectacle of two BRICS members effectively at war, with the United States conducting military operations that directly impact the interests of multiple BRICS members, illustrates the degree to which the comfortable categories of international alignment have become scrambled and unreliable in the current geopolitical environment. Iran's strategic position in the Middle East has never rested exclusively on its own direct military capabilities. For decades, Tehran has invested in building and sustaining a network of allied non-state actors, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, various Shia militias in Iraq and Syria, and the Houthi movement in Yemen that collectively provide Iran with the ability to project force and impose costs on adversaries across a wide geographic area. This network, often referred to as the axis of resistance, represents a form of distributed deterrence that does not depend on any single node and is therefore extremely difficult for any external power to dismantle entirely. The Houthis in Yemen demonstrated during the Gaza conflict that this network was capable of imposing significant economic and logistical costs, even on powers far more militarily capable than themselves. By targeting shipping lanes in the Red Sea with drones and missiles, the Houthis forced major shipping companies to reroute their vessels around the Cape of Good Hope, adding thousands of miles and weeks of travel time to journeys that would normally pass through the Suez Canal. The insurance costs for vessels transiting the region rose dramatically. The disruption to global supply chains was measurable and real. All of this was achieved by a relatively lightly armed non-state actor operating from a devastated country that had been fighting a brutal civil war for nearly a decade. Iran itself chose not to close the Strait of Hormuz during the Gaza conflict, and analysts who observed that restraint sometimes drew the conclusion that Iran was less capable or less willing to use its ultimate economic leverage than had been assumed. This conclusion was almost certainly wrong. The more accurate interpretation is that Iran was making a rational strategic calculation that the costs of closure would fall heavily on itself, given its own economic vulnerability and its continued need to export oil through or around the strait, and that the expected benefits in terms of helping the Palestinian cause did not outweigh those costs, given the limited likelihood that closing Hormuz would actually force a change in Israeli or American policy toward Gaza. When Iran itself is under direct military assault, however, the calculus changes entirely. The threat of Hormuz closure is no longer being weighed against the uncertain benefit of helping an external cause. It is being weighed against the immediate imperative of survival. In a war of attrition, the kind of prolonged, grinding conflict that the situation appears to have become Iran's ability to threaten the global oil supply represents perhaps its most powerful single card, and one that it would have both the motivation and the justification to play. While much of the world's attention has focused on the direct military and geopolitical dimensions of the Iran war, the consequences for Western Europe have been profound and, in certain respects, potentially more economically devastating than for any other region outside the Middle East itself. Western Europe entered this crisis in an already severely weakened economic condition, battered by years of sluggish growth, the inflationary shocks of the post-COVID period, the energy price disruptions caused by the Ukraine conflict, and the political strains generated by populist movements challenging the established governing order across multiple countries. The Iran war delivered a second major blow to European economies precisely at the moment when they were least prepared to absorb it. Energy prices, which had already been elevated by the Ukraine conflict and the disruption of Russian gas supplies, were pushed sharply higher by the disruption to Persian Gulf oil and gas flows. Fertilizer prices, deeply connected to natural gas prices through the energy intensive production processes involved, rose further, threatening the economics of European agriculture and contributing to food price inflation. The prices of a broad range of petrochemical products, including plastics, pharmaceuticals, and chemical feedstocks, also increased significantly. The European governing establishment, already facing severe pressures from rising right wing populist parties, public anger over inflation and immigration, and the strains of managing the Ukraine conflict, found itself confronted with what can only be described as a double strategic catastrophe. The Ukraine war, which NATO and European governments had committed to prosecuting with considerable material and political investment, appeared to be heading toward an unfavorable conclusion for Western interests, with Russian forces making steady progress and the capacity of Ukraine's army to sustain prolonged resistance coming increasingly into question. The outcome in Ukraine has profound implications not just for European security, but for the credibility of the European governing class that staked so much political capital on the war's outcome. The governments of France, Germany, the United Kingdom, Poland, and the other major European states that committed to supporting Ukraine have told their publics that the war was necessary, that NATO solidarity demanded it, and that the investment of resources, military, financial, and political, was justified by the expected benefits. If Russia prevails in Ukraine, all of those claims are called into question in the most embarrassing and damaging way possible. Layered on top of this already serious challenge is the economic pain generated by the Iran war. European consumers facing rising energy bills, rising food prices, and rising costs for a broad range of goods are not in a forgiving mood. The political parties that have been warning for years that the established European governing elites are disconnected from ordinary people's concerns, that European foreign policy is subordinated to American interests at European expense, and that the costs of these adventures are ultimately borne by working people who had no voice in the decisions these parties are gaining strength from the very concrete economic hardships that ordinary Europeans are experiencing. One of the most striking features of the European response to both the Ukraine war and the Iran war has been the unwillingness of European leaders to publicly challenge American policy, even when they privately believe that policy to be seriously mistaken. European governments have, as a rule, fallen into line behind American positions, offered their public support for American initiatives, and refrained from offering criticism that might embarrass Washington or create friction in the transatlantic relationship. This approach reflects a genuine dependence on American security guarantees and a recognition of the asymmetry in military capabilities that makes NATO's European members fundamentally reliant on American power for their ultimate defense. But there is a real cost to this approach. By consistently failing to offer honest public assessments of American policy, even when that policy is creating serious harm to European interests, European governments have allowed themselves to become complicit in decisions they never genuinely supported and have deprived Washington of the kind of frank allied feedback that might, in some circumstances, cause American policymakers to reconsider problematic courses of action. The lesson for European leaders, if they are willing to absorb it, is that silent compliance with American policy is not a costless strategy. When the policies are wrong, Europeans pay the price for them just as much as Americans do, while having had even less say in the decision making. The Iran war has occurred in the context of a broader, decades-long transition in the international system, a transition from the unipolar dominance that the United States enjoyed in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War toward a more genuinely multipolar world in which multiple major powers compete for influence and in which no single state can simply impose its will on others without constraint. This transition has been gradual, contested, and deeply uncomfortable for the United States and its allies, who built their strategic worldview on assumptions of American primacy that no longer accurately reflect the distribution of power in the international system. BRICS, originally an economic grouping comprising Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, has evolved significantly from its origins as a convenient label applied by a Goldman Sachs analyst to a group of large emerging economies with promising growth trajectories. It has become a genuine, if loose and somewhat disorganized, political platform through which major developing world nations articulate their desire for a reformed international order, one that gives them greater voice in multilateral institutions, reduces their dependence on the dollar based financial system, and provides an alternative to the Washington centered economic and security architecture that has prevailed since 1945. The Iran war creates something of an awkward situation for BRICS as an institution, since two of its newest members, Iran and the United Arab Emirates, are on opposite sides of the conflict, at least in terms of their security relationships. Iran is under attack by a coalition that includes the United States and Israel, while the UAE hosts American military installations and has generally maintained a policy of cautious accommodation of American security preferences in the region. The inability of BRICS to convene an emergency summit or issue a unified statement on a conflict directly involving two of its own members points to the real limitations of the grouping as a coherent political actor, as opposed to a forum for shared grievances and aspirations. Despite these institutional limitations, the broader trend toward multipolarity is likely to be accelerated rather than reversed by the Iran war. The conflict has reinforced in very tangible and painful ways the argument that has been gaining traction in the global south for years, that close alignment with the United States involves not just the benefits of access to American technology, markets, and security guarantees, but also the very real risk of being dragged into American military adventures that serve American or Israeli interests at the expense of your own. Countries that have been sitting on the fence in the US China competition are now being pushed, somewhat involuntarily, toward at least greater hedging of their bets, and probably toward genuine diversification of their international relationships. The experience of nations caught in the crossfire of the Iran war, nations like India, that had cultivated close relationships with multiple parties to the conflict and now find themselves economically damaged and diplomatically constrained, contains important lessons for other developing nations navigating the treacherous waters of great power competition in the current era. These lessons are not comfortable ones for governments that have invested heavily in their relationship with Washington, but they are lessons that responsible policymakers must absorb if they are to protect their country's interests effectively. The first and perhaps most fundamental lesson is about the management of dependency. There is a meaningful difference between maintaining friendly relations with a powerful country and allowing that country to accumulate leverage over your economy, your security architecture, and your foreign policy choices. The former is wise, the latter is dangerous. India's experience in the early months of the Trump administration, where an initially warm relationship quickly turned adversarial when Washington decided to play economic hardball over trade disputes, provided an early warning of this dynamic. The Iran war has reinforced it dramatically. The practical implication of this lesson is that countries should work actively to reduce the specific points of leverage that the United States can deploy against them through energy diversification, currency arrangements that reduce dollar dependence, trade relationships that reduce vulnerability to American sanctions, and security arrangements that are not entirely dependent on American goodwill. This is not an argument for hostility toward the United States. It is an argument for the kind of strategic autonomy that allows countries to maintain friendly relations without being subject to coercive pressure in moments when American and national interests diverge. The second important lesson concerns the value of speaking honestly when American policy appears to be heading in a dangerous direction. The European experience of quietly acquiescing to American policy decisions while privately harboring serious doubts about their wisdom provides a cautionary tale that global South nations would do well to study carefully. When governments remain silent about their concerns for fear of diplomatic friction with Washington, they deprive American policymakers of potentially valuable feedback that might cause them to reconsider. They deprive themselves of any moral or political standing to complain when the consequences of those policies fall on their own populations. And they create conditions in which the United States feels free to continue making the same kinds of mistakes indefinitely, since it never faces the social cost of honest allied criticism. There's also a more pragmatic argument for speaking up. Countries that vocally oppose a policy before it is implemented and whose opposition is on record are in a much better political position when the policy fails and the blame begins to be assigned. India's relatively muted response to the march toward war with Iran meant that it received little credit for whatever private concerns it may have expressed. While bearing substantial economic costs from the conflict, it might have been more vocal in opposing. A more forthright approach, making clear through public statements and diplomatic channels that the proposed policy was likely to harm Indian interests and that India opposed it, might not have changed the outcome, but it would have positioned India more advantageously in the subsequent reckoning. The third lesson concerns the relationship between proximity to American power and protection from American coercion. A persistent argument made by analysts who favor close alignment with the United States is that the benefits of proximity access to technology, security guarantees, preferential trade relationships, support in multilateral institutions outweigh the costs and risks. This argument has genuine merit and should not be dismissed. The United States remains the world's most powerful military and economic force, and the ability to call on American support in a crisis has genuine value. But the Iran war demonstrates that proximity to American power is a double-edged sword. The closer a country is to the United States, the more dependent it is on American markets, American technology, American security guarantees, the more vulnerable it is to American policy choices that it had no role in making. A country that has carefully maintained its strategic autonomy, developed multiple strong bilateral relationships, and reduced its dependence on American goodwill is in a much better position to weather an American foreign policy disaster than one that has put all of its eggs in the Washington basket. The metaphor of a rogue elephant is apt. The most dangerous place to be when an elephant is out of control is directly in its path. The Iran war has placed severe new strains on the already battered architecture of multilateral international governance. The United Nations Security Council, the body nominally charged with maintaining international peace and security and with authorizing the use of military force in situations that threaten that peace, was unable to prevent the conflict, unable to stop it once it started, and deeply divided in its response to it. The pattern of Security Council activity during the early stages of the war revealed once again the fundamental dysfunction at the heart of the institution. The veto power held by the 5 permanent members means that any Security Council action is blocked the moment one of those members decides that action is contrary to its interests. In this particular conflict, the United States used its Security Council veto to block any resolution that would have condemned its own military actions or those of Israel. The result was a lopsided and legally dubious outcome in which Security Council activity focused primarily on condemning Iranian responses to the initial attack rather than on the attack itself, a situation that reinforced the perception, widely held in the global South, that international institutions are manipulated by Western powers to serve their interests while being rendered ineffective when those same powers are themselves the party that needs to be constrained. This perception of double standards in the application of international law, of multilateral institutions selectively invoked when convenient and blocked when inconvenient, has profound long-term consequences for the legitimacy of the international legal order. Countries in the global South have been watching the patterns of behavior by Western powers in relation to international law with increasing skepticism for years, noting the contrast between the emphasis placed on rules-based order when it comes to constraining Chinese or Russian behavior and the willingness to bypass those same rules when Western or Israeli interests are at stake. The Iran war has added a major new data point to this body of evidence, and it has been widely noted and discussed. The practical consequence of this erosion of confidence in multilateral institutions is that it weakens the American-led argument for rules-based order as a global organizing principle. If the rules are seen as applying only when they benefit the powerful, they lose their claim to universal legitimacy and become simply another instrument of hegemonic power. Countries that might otherwise have been inclined to support the maintenance of a US-led rules-based order find themselves asking uncomfortable questions about whose rules, based on whose values, serving whose interests, questions to which the honest answers are not always favorable to the Western narrative. Once it became clear that the initial American and Israeli campaign had not achieved its objective of rapid regime change or capitulation, the nature of the conflict shifted fundamentally. A war of attrition, a prolonged grinding contest in which the question is not who can deliver the most devastating opening blow, but rather who can sustain the conflict longest at an acceptable cost, plays to Iran's strengths in ways that the initial air campaign emphatically did not. Understanding why requires a careful examination of the specific assets that Iran brings to a long war. Iran's most powerful single asset in a prolonged conflict is, as has been discussed, its control over or ability to threaten the Strait of Hormuz. But this is not its only card. Iran has developed over decades of facing American and Israeli military superiority, a sophisticated suite of asymmetric capabilities designed specifically to impose costs on technologically superior adversaries. These include a large inventory of ballistic and cruise missiles of varying ranges, capable of striking targets across the Middle East with increasing precision. They include an extensive drone program that has produced cheap, expendable munitions capable of overwhelming air defense systems through sheer numbers. They include cyber capabilities of meaningful offensive reach. And they include the network of allied proxy forces across the region that can be activated to open new fronts and impose costs in multiple theaters simultaneously. In addition to these military capabilities, Iran possesses meaningful demographic and geographical advantages. It is a country of nearly 90 million people, giving it a substantial manpower base for military mobilization. Its territory is vast, and much of it is mountainous and difficult, providing natural defensive advantages that complicate any hypothetical ground invasion and make sustained air campaigns expensive in terms of the number of sorties required to achieve meaningful effects. Its population, whatever the genuine frustrations many Iranians feel with their government, has historically demonstrated a powerful capacity for national mobilization in the face of foreign aggression. Against these Iranian assets, the United States brings overwhelming military technological superiority, precision strike capabilities, air superiority fighters, naval power, intelligence assets, and the logistics networks to sustain prolonged operations. But military technological superiority, as Vietnam demonstrated and as Iraq and Afghanistan repeatedly confirmed, is not sufficient to win a war against a determined adversary who is fighting on or near its own territory and has the means to impose continuing costs. The United States' willingness to absorb those costs, political, economic, and in human lives, is not unlimited, and Iran's strategy, whether articulated explicitly or simply emerging from the logic of the situation, appears to be based on stretching that willingness to its breaking point. Any attempt to predict the future course of a complex, ongoing military conflict involves substantial uncertainty, and intellectual honesty requires acknowledging that uncertainty explicitly, rather than presenting speculative scenarios as confident forecasts. With that important caveat stated, it is nonetheless possible to identify several broad trajectories along which the Iran conflict might develop, each with different implications for the regional and global order. The first possible trajectory is a negotiated ceasefire or de-escalation agreement reached either through direct American-Iranian back-channel negotiations or through mediation by third parties such as Oman, which has historically played this role, Qatar, or China. Such an outcome would require both sides to accept outcomes that fall well short of their stated objectives. The United States would have to accept an Iran that has not been disarmed, destabilized, or significantly weakened. Iran would have to accept the continuation of significant American military presence in the region and the continuation of sanctions pressure. The political difficulty of selling such a compromise domestically on both sides is enormous, but the alternative, continued costly war, creates its own mounting pressures that may eventually make a negotiated exit the least bad option for all parties. The second trajectory involves continued escalation, with both sides gradually moving up the ladder of military intensity, more extensive Iranian attacks on Gulf state infrastructure, possible American attacks on Iranian oil facilities despite Trump's apparent unwillingness to permit such escalation, expanding Iranian proxy activity across the region, and growing disruption to global oil and gas flows. This trajectory is the most dangerous, carrying real risks of outcomes that could be catastrophic both regionally and globally. It also creates the most pressure on the international community to intervene diplomatically, which may paradoxically make some form of negotiated settlement more likely as the economic consequences become increasingly intolerable. The third trajectory, the one that was originally envisioned by American and Israeli planners, but now seems the least probable of the three, involves a decisive military victory that fundamentally changes the Iranian political situation, leading to regime change, negotiated disarmament, or some other outcome that achieves the stated objectives of the campaign. The reasons this trajectory seems unlikely have been discussed at length in this analysis. The resilience of the Iranian state, the absence of any credible domestic political force capable of replacing the current government in an orderly and non-chaotic fashion, and the enormous difficulty of achieving truly decisive outcomes through air power alone against a large, diverse, and strategically prepared adversary. The Iran war, in whatever form it eventually ends, will leave a long and dark shadow over American foreign policy, over the Middle East regional order, and over the global international system. The decision to launch a major military campaign against Iran without a coherent strategy for achieving decisive victory, without serious consultation with allies whose interests were directly at stake, and without adequate preparation for the most predictable adverse consequences, represents a foreign policy failure of historic proportions. Its consequences will be felt for years, possibly for decades, in the form of higher energy prices, weakened American alliances, strengthened adversaries, and a global political environment more skeptical of American leadership and more open to alternative power centers than at any point in the post-Cold War era. The human costs of this failure are the most immediate and the most morally urgent. The children who died or were injured in southern Iran when cruise missile fragments struck their school. The Iranian civilians who had no say in their government's foreign policy and bore its consequences nonetheless. The American service members whose lives and futures were placed at risk in a conflict that was entered without adequate strategic preparation. The Ukrainians whose resistance to Russian aggression has been weakened by the diversion of American resources and attention. The Indian farmers whose economic livelihoods have been damaged by energy price shocks they had no role in creating. The list of ordinary people paying the price for elite decisions made in Washington and Jerusalem is long, and it will grow longer. The broader geopolitical legacy of the conflict is likely to be a world that is measurably less stable, less orderly, and less amenable to American leadership than it was before the first Tomahawk missiles struck Iranian territory. Russia has been economically strengthened and strategically relieved of pressure. China has gained credibility as a stable and responsible international actor, by contrast with an America that appears impulsive, unilateral, and indifferent to the interests of its partners. The Global South has received a powerful new confirmation of its long-standing suspicions about the reliability and judgment of American power. And the Israel lobby, whose role in driving America toward this misadventure has been acknowledged more openly and by more mainstream figures than ever before, may find that its remarkable run of influence over American foreign policy has finally begun to generate a serious domestic backlash. Whether the United States can absorb the lessons of this disaster and adjust its foreign policy approach accordingly is one of the central questions of the coming years. The historical record of great powers learning from their own strategic failures is not encouraging. The tendency to double down, to seek face-saving measures that perpetuate bad decisions, and to suppress honest internal analysis that might threaten established narratives is deeply embedded in the bureaucratic and political culture of major states. But the scale of the current failure, the breadth of its consequences, and the openness with which its causes are now being discussed across the American political spectrum at least create the conditions in which genuine learning and adjustment are possible, even if they are far from guaranteed. For the rest of the world, for the nations and peoples who are living with the consequences of decisions made in Washington and Jerusalem, but who had little or no say in making them, the task is to navigate as intelligently and carefully as possible through the turbulence created by American strategic dysfunction, to protect their national interests as effectively as they can, to build the partnerships and the strategic autonomy that will reduce their vulnerability to future American misadventures, and to work where possible toward an international order that is more genuinely multipolar, more governed by law and mutual respect, and more capable of managing great power competition without producing catastrophic wars. It is a difficult and uncertain path, but it is the one that the circumstances of the early 21st century demand. The Iran War is not simply a story about Iran or about the United States and Israel or about any single conflict in any single region. It is a story about the kind of world we are becoming, a world in which the old certainties of American dominance are giving way to a more contested and more dangerous multipolar competition, in which the rules and norms that once provided at least some constraint on state behavior are under severe and potentially irreversible strain, and in which the decisions of powerful states have consequences that ripple outward across the entire international system with a speed and force that leaves ordinary people across the globe vulnerable to disasters they never voted for and cannot easily escape. Meeting that challenge will require wisdom, honesty, and courage from political leaders across the world, qualities that are, regrettably, in shorter supply than they need to be. The conversations and analyses examined throughout this document reflect a genuinely important, if deeply troubling, moment in the evolution of American foreign policy and the global international order. They deserve to be engaged with seriously, debated vigorously, and remembered carefully because the decisions and patterns of behavior they describe will shape the world that future generations inherit.